Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh. The land of pagodas is often used to describe Burma, also known as Myanmar, where almost 90% of the population is Buddhist. Buddhist communities have played significant roles in Burmese society as both spiritual leaders and moral custodians. Furthermore, they have been a source of inspiration and political change under British rule and more recently the ruling military regime. Joining us to talk about this political activism of Buddhists in Burma is Bush Gulati, chair of the Committee for the Restoration of Democracy in Burma and a professor emeritus of English at George Brown College here in Toronto. Thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you for inviting me.
Now, I guess why don't we start with more of the historical context, and maybe you could describe the relationship that has existed within Burma between, I guess, Buddhist monks and the lay society. Has there always been, I guess, that sense of interdependence or sort of moral symbiosis? Is that correct?
You are correct in that there has been a symbiosis. Buddhism came to Burma in 300 BC as a result of missions sent by Emperor Asoka of India to a kingdom in Lower Burma at Patong, and the people were the Mons. 700 years later, tribes from northern Burma invaded Patong, took all the Buddhist texts and adopted Buddhism and took it back to northern Burma in a place called Pagan. So that is where Buddhism took roots, and the king, Anorata, became a patron of Theravada Buddhism.
And it sort of spread from there.
And since the first king who brought Buddhism to Burma, became the patron of Buddhists and Buddhism, there has been a very close relationship between the ruler and the rulers and Buddhism, and of course the people at large.
And could you maybe elaborate on that? Given that here in the West we're used to sort of the relationship between Christianity and the king, is there a similar, I guess, was there a similar union of church and state in terms of the way society was governed?
That is something difficult for me to define. I'm not a scholar in these things, as you've said in the introduction. What the monks do see or supervise is that the king plays his role by the rules of conduct laid in Buddhism. And there are 10 rules for a king, and the king rules by, first of all, the king must be acceptable to the people. The ruler must be acceptable. And then he should work for the welfare of the people. These are two cardinal principles. And the monks see to that. And other than that, of course, the king has other rules and other duties like a layperson to follow.
But there is a greater accountability and a moral accountability.
Moral accountability, and he has to be a role model of virtue. And the monks see to that.
And historically that's been the case in terms of that relationship?
Been the case, yes.
Now, we mentioned a little in my intro the relationship under British rule, that there was, I guess, political involvement on behalf of the monks. Could you maybe elaborate on that or give an example of how that played out?
Politics and social injustice are things that are difficult for me to segregate. If monks participate in politics, it's not politics per se as social injustice.
Right, sort of small p politics rather than partisan politics.
So when you mentioned about the intervention of monks during British times, there was only one monk known as Otama, and who took it upon himself to, having seen the injustices that were being committed by the ruling class in Burma, he undertook upon himself to visit neighboring countries, and he saw what was going on, especially Japan, and he was quite impressed by the progress there, and he came back with stories and told people what was going on, and that if they wanted their rights, they would have to speak for themselves, and he as a monk could not do that. So there was another monk, Uwezora, who followed his lead, and it is from there that people became aware of the injustices that they were suffering, and that it was up to them to rise up against that.
So it's interesting, it sounds almost like a, dare I say, a democratic agitation, that
Yes.
rather than seize power themselves,
Oh, no.
it's more trying to facilitate the populace to stand up for their own rights.
That is not a jurisdiction of the monk to seize power, no.
Right.
They just see that justice is done, social justice especially.
So that the people act on their own rights rather than have to step forward.
And if there is injustice, they will speak. They will not wield arms, they will not wield power.
And there is, I assume, we mentioned that 90% of Burmese society was Buddhist.
Yes.
I assume that in general there's a very close relationship between the monks and the lay society as a whole. Is that correct?
That is true. The two are intertwined. The people depend on the monks for spiritual and moral sustenance, and the monks depend on the people for their material support to keep body and soul together, food and shelter, basically.
Okay, let's just take a commercial break for a moment. But when we come back, we'll talk more about the modern day and how politics in Burma are really heading towards a conflict in terms of the way the military regime is refusing to cede to the popular will.
Okay.
I'm speaking with Bush Gulati from the Committee for the Restoration of Democracy in Burma. We'll be back with more on this discussion right after this short break. You're watching 3D Dialogue. Welcome back to 3D Dialogue. I'm Jesse Hirsh, and I'm here with Bush Gulati, chair of the Committee for the Restoration of Democracy in Burma. Now, before the break, we were just establishing, I guess, the social and contextual relationship of Buddhism in Burmese society. And I'm curious to hear more about how children are, I guess, initiated or brought into the fold as both members of Burmese society, but also as Buddhists. Can you maybe describe that, I guess, coming-of-age process?
When a child is about 7 years old, his parents take him, a male child, to the nearest monastery, and there he is initiated as a novice. He's introduced to the alphabet, and then given the 3 R's and an introduction to Buddhism. And the child stays there for as long as his parents want him to stay or he wants to stay. And then he keeps returning every now and then for spiritual sustenance and further studies in Buddhism.
So it's really a lifelong relationship.
It's a lifelong relationship. And typically, a male person in Burma would spend his vacation in the monastery.
It would be almost a spiritual getting away.
It's a spiritual retreat.
Now let's shift gears and let's get into the modern context, I guess, in terms of the military dictatorship that has been in power for several decades. And while there have been very, I would say, vibrant democracy movements, only now as the monks and what the media is calling the Saffron Revolution, as they stand, as you say, try to facilitate the standing up of Burmese society to exercise their rights. How do you see this as an extension or a culmination of this tradition and culture within Burma?
The military seized power in 1962, March the 2nd, on very flimsy pretexts. And they've been in power since then. And they've really run the economy and people's lives to the ground. People can't take it anymore. There have been uprisings in the past. The major uprising that took place was in 1988, which was led by the students, and the monks supported them because they were fighting for a just cause. That was put down very severely and very badly. What is happening right now, the movement, the uprising is still led by the students, but the monks took the initiative to shield them, as it were to say, because...
And this because of the vulnerability in a military regime, that the students can be wiped out all too easily.
As you say, the monks realized that the students, like before, would be vulnerable this time too. So they took it upon themselves to shield the students and to lead the movement for them. And having led it, they have retreated to their monasteries.
Well, and as you said earlier, there's this relationship between the students and the monks that's very intimate because of how kids get their education.
Exactly.
They're initiated into society.
Yes. Before the coming of the British, the only education that the person received was at the monastery. But after the coming of the British, the education system that was adopted by the British was a secular system where world geography and world history and the sciences were taught, which was not the case before. But historically and traditionally, the people have received their education only at the monasteries. And this is still the case in the countryside.
Now, is there a point at which, let's say, the military regime steps a moral or a cultural bound and goes after the monks? I mean, is there a point at which, I guess, the sanctimony or the status that the monks are held by the populace is not held by the military? Is there a risk of that?
The top echelon in the military are themselves Buddhists,
right?
Which is why the monks
are able to step forward.
Were able to step forward, and under the belief that they would not be subject to any attacks. But that has not been the case. So what it really shows you is that the people at the top have lost their heads. And the killings that you see are not killings by Buddhist soldiers. They have brought in non-Buddhist soldiers from the tribal areas in the border regions, and these people are not they are not Buddhists. They are either Christians or animists. And some of them don't even speak Burmese, so they don't know what they are doing. They just take orders from the upper echelons, and they couldn't care less whether they are attacking monks or non-monks.
But one must assume that at some point the even vaguest amount of legitimacy that the regime has goes. And I mean, obviously we're at this point now where the people are at such a breaking point that they just can't stand it. How far do the monks go? Is there a limit to what they're capable of, given their own vows and given their own beliefs?
They will remain within their vows, of that I am certain. They have provided moral leadership, they have spoken out, and they have retreated to their, as I said, to their monasteries. They will not go very far. Now it is up to the people, and I think it is up to the world to help the people. On their own, the people cannot do very much.
Well, and that's a very good point. Do you feel that the world is responding? Do you feel that the international community is stepping forward?
So far, the world has responded only nominally. The action lies basically with the United Nations. There are United Nations peacekeeping forces in Darfur, in Rwanda, in Yugoslavia.
But why not Burma?
In Haiti. Why not Burma? Burmese conditions are not any different. Conditions are identical.
I mean, without being too crass, is there oil or other valuable resources that, you know, world powers would want to secure in Burma?
There is a lot of gas in Burma. There is oil that was hitherto a little expensive to mine, but with the rise in oil prices, that is also viable right now. And the major customer is China. The regime exists
because of the patronage of China.
In a colonial relationship with China, and China has realized its 1,000-year-old dream to possess Burma and to open its back door to the West, so which is why they are building a pipeline from the borders of Burma on the Bay of Bengal right up the Irrawaddy Valley into southwestern China. And you consider this against the geopolitical reality of going through the Singapore Straits, Malacca Straits, and all the way around the Philippines. It's a very big saving in...
Well, and unfortunately, you speak more directly to the political corruption that has sustained this regime. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, but I think this has been both inspirational in terms of the way that the monks are able to mobilize society and inspire society, and hopefully the rest of the world will take note from that, and we will see the return of democracy to Burma very shortly.
I thank you very much for your good wishes.
Thank you, too.
Thank you for inviting me.
That was Bush Gulati, chair of the Committee for the Restoration of Democracy in Burma and a professor of emeritus of English at George Brown College in Toronto. Up next, the Buddhist strategy on how to overcome forgetfulness. You're watching 3D Dialogue.